Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 653. Today we're going to talk about Tiny Towns. This is a recent release from AEG and first-time designer Peter McPherson. This is a very kind of interesting, different game. It's very light. It takes about 30 minutes to 45 minutes, and it plays 1 to 6 players. And what players are doing, they're kind of building like a little town on a grid. So nothing really exciting, but let me show you how it works, and then I'll come back and tell you what I think of it. Okay, so the first thing to talk about is that each player is going to get a board that has this kind of grid on it. So here I've got it set up for 2 players. And like I said, you're going to be building these various different types of buildings onto your grid and scoring points with them in a variety of different ways. So how do we do that? So in the center of the table here, you can see I've got 7 different cards, and each of these cards corresponds to one of these wooden building types. So here we have, for example, the well, and it's got that little sort of circle there, and here are the little well pieces. Here we have a temple. You can see that kind of orange church looking type of building, and of course we have a bunch of those right here, and so on around the table. Now this setup of buildings is going to score points in a variety of different ways. Of course, you get a score pad here for each of the players, and you can see each of the different types of buildings is represented there, and they're going to score points differently each game, because all of these cards, except for the cottage card here, is going to be random. So for example, each of these types has a little deck of cards that go with it. So the well can instead be one of these other 3 cards. So for example, instead of the well, it could be a fountain next game, and it's have a different ability there to score points in a different way than the well does. The tailor over on the right here, this yellow building, has these sets of cards, and then these, you could have these dealt out in a different way. So you're going to deal out a random card from each of these stacks, except for, again, the cottage, which is the same every game. As well, you have these monuments here in this purple deck. Now these are individual to the player, so we're going to take 2, give them to each player. They're going to look at them, see how they might score, and then you're going to choose one for your game, put that face down in front of you, and then discard the other out of the game. So everybody's going to have a different monument. So how do you actually build buildings and score points? Well, very simple. One player is going to get the start player marker, which is this little builder hammer here, and they are going to choose one of these 5 different resources. So they're just different colored cubes, but you've got like brick and stone and wood and all that kind of stuff. So maybe I say brick or just say red. So everybody around the table is going to take a red cube, and they're going to put it on any one of these little grid spots. So maybe I put it there, and then Billy puts his over there. Now this is going to pass around the table, and then so now it'll be Billy's turn, and maybe he'll say yellow. And so he'll take a yellow cube and put it somewhere, and I'll put it somewhere. And you just go around and around like that. Now after everybody has taken a cube and placed it somewhere, anybody that can legally build a building can do so. And how do you know that you can do that? Well, first of all, you could look at your monuments here and see, oh, I need a configuration like this, a yellow, a blue, and then a gray, in that sort of configuration. And it doesn't matter, you know, how you turn it. There's no like orientation to the sides of the board. So if I had, let's see, yellow, blue, and gray like this, then of course this would obviously work, and I could build my monument. But if my board was turned or something like that, and oriented to me that way, then of course that would also work. But of course we've got 7 different buildings out here that we can also build. So let's take a look at the cottage. So here we've moved along a little bit. We're in our 3rd turn. We've had yellow and blue chosen, and then somebody chooses red, and so Billy puts the red over here or something, and I decide to put it here. So that's going to match the cottage. So I can take and build any number of buildings that I can legally build here. So sometimes you can do more than one, but in this simple example, we're going to discard all of these cubes that are in that configuration back to the general supply, and then take the matching wooden piece for that building and put it in any of those spaces that we had cubes in. So maybe I'll decide to put it here. And so now we've built the cottage. So now on future turns, when we take cubes and put them on different spots, we can no longer use this particular spot. So as you sort of go along and build over the course of the game, you're going to start to sort of eat up the available area, and it's going to be much harder to build different buildings, especially maybe something like this trading post here, which you can see you need more an intricate configuration of cubes. So you're going to keep playing in that way until you can no longer put any cubes on the board. So let's throw out some random buildings here like so. And so as we've gone along here, maybe there are no spots for you to build. So as you take cubes, you just get kind of stuck theoretically, and you can't put anything on your board anymore, and now you're stuck and you're out of the game. So all the other players will keep going, and theoretically as you sort of build things up, maybe I get these down, I get another building out, then frees up some space, and then you keep going. But once you're kind of locked in, you're locked out of the game, and you keep going until everybody is locked out. And it's theoretically possible for one player to kind of play maybe a couple of turns on their own, usually one or two, not usually forever. And then at that point, you're going to score based on any of the buildings out here. And then if you had a chance to build your monument, then you will score points for that. So let's take a look at this example. I just kind of randomly pulled these out. So you're just going to kind of walk down each of the building types and then put in your number of points for that for you. And so let's start with the cottage here. This is 3 points if this building is fed. Well, what does that mean here? Well, all of these red kind of farm looking buildings are going to feed your cottages. And this says feeds 4 buildings anywhere in your town. And you can see the little icon there matches the cottage icon. So once you build a farm, you can have up to 4 cottages, and those are going to count as fed, and they're going to score you your 3 points. If you get a 5th cottage, it's not going to be fed until you build another farm or whatever the corresponding card is for that. Looking at the next card here, trading post. This is worth 1 point, and you may treat this as a wild resource for future buildings. So that could be very, very interesting. If you build this early on, you're going to have the ability to convert one of your cubes into a wild resource. And the inn is a little more interesting here. So it's 3 points, if not in a row or column with another inn. So you're gonna, when you place the inn, you're gonna have to take a look at where you place it relative to other inns that are possibly on your board. Here's the well again. This is 1 point for each adjacent cottage. Again, that's the first one that you built. So these are gonna be kind of next to each other. The temple, 4 points if adjacent to 2 or more fed cottages. So again, these are going to be competing for space with your wells. And tailor, 1 point plus 1 point for each other tailor in the 4 center squares of your town. So that is just the random configuration that I happen to draw. The game does give you kind of a beginner setup for each of these different types of cards. It'll tell you use the farm and use the trading post or whatever it says to actually set up for your first game. And then of course you're going to score any points for any of these monuments that you had. So let's just take a look at this random one here. 2 points. Empty squares in your town are worth 0 points instead of -1 point, which what happens is at the end of the game, once you have stopped, you will then clear off any cubes that didn't get converted into buildings. In this case, this is really bad. Each of these normally is worth -1 point from your overall score. But for example, if you had built this Cathedral of Catarina, they would be worth 0 points instead. And of course, here's the monument piece. Everybody gets one of those to build. And that is the gist of the game. There is a variant here, or I should say 2 variants, where instead of the start player calling the resource for that turn, you can actually draw random resources out of this deck, and then this is also what you will use if you decided to play it solo, and then you kind of try to get a high score. There's a couple more rules involved with this variant in terms of like when you reshuffle this deck and so on, but basically you're just kind of drawing a random resource instead of the start player naming a resource. Okay, so that was Tiny Towns, and that probably could have been a more boring rules explanation, but I'm not sure. So this game is amazing, but let's jump into the kind of the 3 pillars of reviews, and then I can kind of get to why it's amazing. First is the player count. I talked about it's 1 to 6 players. I haven't played it with 6, but I played it with 1, 3, and 4, and it's worked fine at all of those. I'm not really a fan of the solo aspect of it as much as playing with other players, which I'll talk a little bit more when I get some more of the reviewy stuff at the end. But it works fine with 1 player. And I think it's probably going to be better at the 3 and 4 player count, but I still would play this with 5 or 6. But again, I'll talk about that in the review. I think it's going to be fine at that player count, but there's a reason why I think it's probably better at that kind of middleweight player count. In terms of the play time, Since the game is simultaneous, theoretically, even if you're playing with 6 versus 3 players, it should be about the same. So I think I could see it taking a little bit longer with 6 because there is a little bit of AP the first couple of times you've played this. But once you kind of get the hang of it, it's not going to be too much. So it should be right in that half hour, maybe 45-minute ballpark. I played it 3 times the other night in a row. And, once on the third game, it was like half an hour easy. And then the other last pillar of review would be, what is the game like? And that is a tough one. It's like a couple of things. I would say in some ways it's like Dominion, which is a deck building game, the first deck building game. And in some other ways it's like a game called Karuba, which came out a couple of years ago. So if you're familiar with either of those games, you can probably get a sense of where I'm going. But it's really not too close to those. So the thing that I really like about this game is, again, the player interaction at that kind of specific player count. I did get a chance to play with where you kind of flip the cards and you do a random resource and everybody has to do that resource. That's okay, like the game still works, and I think if you play it with a larger player count, it might just kind of feel like that, because if there's 6 people at the table, they're all going to have like the different idea in their head in terms of what kind of map and stuff they're trying to build and how they're trying to plot out all their points. But once you kind of play it a couple of times and have played it with other people that have played it, at that kind of smaller player count, you can kind of keep an eye on what people are calling and what they're kind of going after, and how these purple monument cards will kind of affect your approach. Because a lot of these purple monument cards are going to give you some kind of special ability, some kind of weird way to augment your scoring, and all kinds of janky stuff. So you can see, if you try to be clever about where you're putting those cubes in a place that doesn't lock you in, because this is what the game is trying to do, is lock you into a bad decision, because you're like, well, I can build, if I have a blue and a yellow next to each other here, that's great because I could build this building or finish off this other building, but I can't guarantee that the other players around the table are going to call the cubes that I need, and they may actually call cubes specifically that don't help me, especially towards the end of the game when there's no room on the board at all. But as you start to play through the game and you kind of look at the cards that are set up in a certain way, then you start to sort of hedge your bets and place in like the most safe area that gives you the most options possible. It's like, so if I put this blue cube here or here, it'll still help me with this other building, but it might help me with another building if other people call other colors, like I'm expecting red and brown for this one and maybe yellow and blue for this other one. So you kind of try to keep an open mind, as it were, as you sort of start to lay out your little town. And that's the interesting part of the game, where you can kind of jump and try to be flexible, but the game really is smacking you over the head. And as you start to play again with other players, you can really start to call things that it's like you're calling yellow again, but meanwhile, yellow is okay for me, and it's really just not okay for the other player, possibly. So that's a very interesting kind of dynamic there. Now, in the way that it's like Dominion, it's basically like setting up all the cards to do your deck building, like you do in Dominion. So you set up all your cards, and then you're like, okay, I'm looking at these cards. This is kind of the strategy I want to go for my deck. It's similar here, where you're looking at these cards like, well, maybe I want to do a strategy that's heavy on the cottages and getting them fed. Maybe my purple monument card seems really cool to me, so I'm going to try to do stuff kind of based around its ability. And all kind of different combinations of that, the theaters, the cathedrals, the inns, and that kind of thing. Because you're not going to be able to like score every single card in every single building to its optimal degree. It's just impossible to happen. So you have to really early on, I think, choose, okay, this is my point scoring strategy. I'm going to go for these based on how the cubes are sort of laid out. And I'm like, well, these cubes sort of complement each other, but maybe these are worth more points. And then the game starts, and then people start calling cubes that are nothing like strategy you wanted to do. So then you're kind of, it's really great to kind of see that, it gives you that kind of overarching strategy, and then just people smash it because they're doing something completely different. And just that whole balance of stuff, it just makes it really fun. And the other thing is interesting about it is it's just so simple. If you remember Karuba, where everybody had the exact same stack of tiles, somebody would flip one over, and then everybody would find and choose that exact same one, and then everybody would build different path, but with the same tiles in the same order as everybody else. And this has that same idea. It's like you call blue, so everybody's got to do a blue. But I might use the blue for cottages, you might use it for wells, or whatever the kind of thing is. So that simplicity of pick a color, everybody puts it down, and then everybody's looking at what to do with it. I really can't emphasize enough. I think this game has got a ton of replayability. Like I said, we played it 3 times in a row the other night, and you've got the tons of these different monument cards that give you little abilities and extra bonus scorings, and just a way to just kind of shuffle everything up and mess around with it. Even playing the same setup, 2, 3, 4 times, you can approach it a bunch of different ways. And it's not like, okay, we played one setup, shuffle everything up. Like I said the other night when we played a bunch of times, it's like, let's keep this for another game because I want to try this again. And I want to get back into this again and try something else. Like one time I did a very heavy cottage strategy. And the other one, like I said, I did another inn strategy, which was in some ways like more of a push your luck idea, because like, well, if I really pull this in strategy off, I can get a ton of points, but maybe it's a little bit trickier, whereas the cottage one's a little bit safer, but it's not as many points. So this is like a ton to chew on in the game with each kind of setup. But again, it's so dead simple. Pick a color, put it on your board, go. Pick a color, put it on your board, go. So I definitely highly recommend this game. I think for everybody, this is going to be a good sort of crossover, I think, between like a family game that you can just pick up and play because the rules are so dead simple, and then there's really some little kind of nooks and crannies to sort of chew on in terms of your approach. So if you're play a lot of games, then you're going to have a lot to really chew on and process with this game. So this is definitely one of the best games I've played this year, and I would say even the last year. This is one of the better games I've played in a while. It's dead simple, lots of strategy. There's that extra layer of, kind of the X factor of calling a cube that is going to hose over Billy. And it's like, why are you calling red again? But I'm like, red works for me, but it's not going to work for you at all. So it's just very, very interesting to see kind of the dynamics and the interplay with the cards, especially these little factory ones. They all have kind of weird abilities and stuff that don't really score points too much. So there's a lot kind of going on just in terms of not just the Tetris bit of it, but all the kind of combo card ability parts of it. Anyway, so high recommendation for Tiny Towns. I think everybody's got to at least give it a shot. I was very surprised by that, by the game, because first of all, it's called Tiny Towns, and I was like, okay, what is this, some Kickstarter, like, little medium weight Euro thing? And like, and you put cubes on a board, and like, you build a little village. I'm like, how many thousands of games do that? But I was very, very surprised and pleased to see that this actually was very clever, very, simple in terms of the rules, but there's a lot kind of going on, and it's really fun. And there's just, everybody's just crying at the table because they're just getting, constricted and can't do what they want, but in a very, very fun way, because you have your plans like almost come together, and then, maybe you can like dodge in and out and kind of get them off or not most of the time. Anyway, so that is Tiny Towns. Definite recommend. Thanks.